Apparently walking to your own car is a threat now. That's what I learned when my son, unarmed calm, saying nothing, had a pistol aimed at him by a guy in a fake badge. HOA enforcement, they called it. I call it an ambush. And while everyone else shrugged it off like these things happen, I knew there was something deeper, a reason they wanted us scared. The way they watched us, documented us, pushed every button. It wasn't random. It was personal. Comment if you've ever dealt with something this insane, because I can't be the only one. Hit like, subscribe, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, that little thanks button down below means a lot. Until last Tuesday, my retirement was supposed to be peaceful. My name's Michael, 52, sold my logistics business home full-time now. My son Daniel had just pulled into our driveway after 3 weeks of deployment exercises, and I was watching from the kitchen window as he grabbed grocery bags from his truck bed. 28 years old, built like someone who runs 10 miles before breakfast, because he actually does, and carrying himself with that particular kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of. When Daniel moved, it was deliberate, practiced, like every motion had purpose. I was about to head out and help him when I noticed Howard Briggs hustling down the sidewalk, that ridiculous HOA security shirt stretched tight across his gut, his radio crackling with static and what sounded like someone yelling about a prowler with a knife near the driveways. We'd had run-ins with Howard before, small things, parking complaints, nothing like what was about to happen. Daniel does carry a tactical knife clipped to his belt, completely legal, completely visible, along with his military-grade flashlight and those Kevlar gloves he forgets to take off sometimes. Howard spotted all of this from 20 feet away, and immediately, without even a second of hesitation or thought, drew his weapon and aimed it directly at my son. "Drop everything! Hands where I can see them!" He barked, his hands shaky and voice carrying a rookie's overconfidence. Daniel's response was pure training, that silent count they teach them before any movement in hostile situations. Then he set the bags down with this deliberate slowness that somehow communicated both compliance and complete lack of fear. His jaw clenched, his eyes tracked Howard's trigger finger, but he said nothing as he shifted slightly to the left, creating an angle from the barrel. "Sir, I'm putting groceries down. No sudden movements." The words were calm, but there was something underneath them. Maybe it was the "sir" that carried just enough edge to it, or maybe it was how his eyes never left Howard's trigger finger. I stepped outside at that point, my bare feet hitting hot concrete, and noticed an apple had rolled from one of Daniel's bags toward the curb. I bent to pick it up, then froze mid-reach when I realized how that might look to someone already pointing a gun at my son. Howard, multiple recordings happening. Daniel, nice and easy, I said, trying to inject some reality into whatever movie Howard thought he was starring in. But Howard kept that weapon raised, his tone faltering as sweat dripped down his temples. "This individual is carrying weapons," he announced to nobody in particular, though I noticed several neighbors had started gathering on their porches, phones already out and recording. Martha Lane appeared from somewhere behind Howard, her face going pale when she saw the scene, but she recovered quickly, that HOA president mask sliding into place like she'd practiced it in a mirror. "This is an internal matter. We'll handle this according to community guidelines," she said, though I caught how her eyes kept darting to all those recording phones. The funny thing about doorbell cameras is they catch everything, including things you don't expect them to notice, like the faded city marker near our driveway, and those barely visible paint lines on the curb edge that would become so important later. I couldn't have known it then, but Gavin Price's camera was capturing all of this from the perfect angle, showing not just the confrontation, but the exact property boundaries that would flip this entire situation on its head. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and without looking away from Howard's gun, I pulled it out to see a text from Gavin with a screenshot attached. "Got original video, BTW, that marker shows city property." Reading those words while watching Howard's finger hover near the trigger, I felt the tension rise, wondering if this discovery would save us or push things over the edge. Just when I thought it would de-escalate, a soda can fell from another bag and clanged on the concrete. the sound sharp enough to make Howard flinch his gun, wavering for just a second before he steadied it again. Susan had come to the doorway by then, gripping the frame hard enough to turn her knuckles white, and Daniel maintained that 1,000-yard stare I'd seen in photos from deployment zones, the one that says he's running calculations about distances and reaction times, and probably 17 different ways this could end. The standoff lasted maybe 3 minutes total, but felt like an hour, with Howard eventually lowering his weapon only after 2 actual police cars pulled up, apparently called by multiple neighbors who recognized the difference between HOA authority and criminal threatening. Howard tried to explain about suspicious individuals and community safety, but the officers were more interested in why he was pointing a gun at someone carrying groceries into their own house. Martha jumped in with something about covenant enforcement and designated security protocols, but even she seemed to realize how thin that sounded when the senior officer asked to see Howard's permit for armed security work. The silence that followed that question was beautiful in its own way, broken only by Daniel's quiet voice saying, "I'll be inside whenever you need my statement, officers." As the police sorted through the initial mess and Howard retreated to his house with Martha trailing behind, making urgent phone calls, I stood there in my driveway, looking at that faded city marker Gavin had pointed out, wondering how something so small and overlooked could matter so much. Daniel walked past me toward the house, pausing just long enough to say, "Document everything, Dad. This isn't over." The way he said it flat and certain made me realize my son had shifted into a different kind of warfare, one fought with paperwork and evidence instead of weapons, though honestly I wasn't sure which version was more dangerous when you're dealing with people who think a clipboard gives them the right to aim guns at your family. I just didn't realize how far they'd already gone. The next morning arrived with an HOA warning notice taped to our door, phrases like harboring a dangerous individual and immediate remediation required jumping out at me. The words blurred not because I couldn't read, but because I couldn't believe it. Susan read it over my shoulder, her teacher instincts kicking in as she started identifying every grammatical error and questionable legal reference, which was her way of processing anger without throwing things. I pulled out the property deed immediately and started cross-referencing parcel numbers, something telling me we needed to understand exactly where our property ended and city jurisdiction began. I knew what I had to do next, so I got dressed, grabbed my laptop and phone, and headed to the police station to file a formal report about the gun incident, making sure to bring copies of all the videos neighbors had sent me overnight. The desk sergeant took one look at the footage and immediately called for a detective who watched the confrontation with this expression that shifted from professional interest to genuine concern. "Has this man done this before?" she asked, and I had to admit I didn't know but suspected we were about to find out. While I was at the station, Gavin showed up at our house, eager to share what he'd discovered during what he called a research binge that had kept him up until 4 in the morning. He'd helped us once before, when a landlord tried to fake an easement quiet, efficient, brilliant at finding what others missed. He opened a state database page showing official security licenses typed in HOA, security team for our neighborhood, and pointed at the screen where it displayed in bold letters, "No record found." Plus, he added with the enthusiasm of someone who had found gold in their backyard, Howard failed a police psychological evaluation 3 years ago for impulse control issues. Gavin then walked me outside to that faded marker near our driveway, pulled up property maps on his phone, and showed me something that made my jaw drop. This whole section from your driveway to about 15 feet into the street, that's actually city right-of-way, not HOA property. He traced the boundaries with his finger, explaining how the original developers had ceded this strip to the city for utility access, but the HOA had been pretending to control it for years. Without a state security license and operating on city property, your HOA's insurance might refuse any claims related to Howard's actions, he said, and I could see him mentally calculating lawsuit potential, like a shark smelling blood in the water. I went inside and pulled out our covenant documents, highlighting every clause about boundaries, enforcement limitations, and the specific requirements for anyone claiming security authority. Through careful questioning of long-time neighbors, part of Howard's backstory started emerging. Former mall security guard who'd applied to the police force 4 times, rejected each time for various reasons that were starting to make sense. His brother had died overseas in Afghanistan 8 years ago, left him with this military obsession that manifested in collecting tactical gear, studying combat videos, and building this whole fantasy about being the neighborhood's protector. I didn't want to believe it at first, not Howard, not someone we'd once trusted to watch the place when we traveled, but the evidence was mounting. The insurance angle got me thinking, so I called the HOA's insurance company, directly navigating through their phone tree until I reached someone in liability assessment. Hypothetically, I said, if an insured party lacks proper security licensing and causes an incident while claiming to perform security duties, who covers the liability? The long silence on the other end told me everything before the agent carefully responded. That would potentially void coverage and expose individual board members to personal liability. I wrote down the claim number she gave me and thanked her for information that Martha and Howard clearly hadn't considered. That afternoon, Daniel set up our complete surveillance system, multiple cameras with clear recording in progress signs, meeting every legal requirement for admissible evidence synced to atomic timed servers for court-ready timestamp accuracy. We're not just documenting future incidents, he explained while adjusting the final angle. We're creating a chain of evidence that shows pattern and escalation. We checked the footage expecting nothing major, but what we found was organized, deliberate surveillance going back days before the incident. Late that evening, around 9:30, when most people were inside watching television, one of our new cameras captured something interesting in the parking lot behind the community center. Martha was handing Howard a manila folder, their conversation too quiet to hear clearly, but the body language suggested urgency and conspiracy. The camera's microphone did pick up one fragment when Martha raised her voice slightly. "We control the narrative. Stick to the script about safety concerns." Howard nodded, tucked the folder under his arm, and they separated quickly when another car's headlights swept across the lot. I saved that footage to 3 different drives, emailed it to myself, and sent a copy to Gavin, who responded immediately with a thumbs-up emoji and a message saying he was starting to map out a pattern of HOA citations that had spiked dramatically since Howard joined the board 2 years ago. Daniel came into my office while I was organizing, everything looked at my notes and timelines spread across the desk, and gave me one of those rare smiles that reminded me of when he was 10 and had figured out how to beat me at chess. "Smart keeping everything legal and documented," he said, then added something that stuck with me. "In Afghanistan, we learned that patience and proper documentation create leverage nobody expects. The enemy prepares for violence, not bureaucracy." Just as he finished talking, my email chimed with a message from the insurance company marked high priority. Coverage under review for armed security activities without proper licensing. Board members may face personal liability for any incidents. We thought we had leverage, but leverage makes people reckless, and desperate people do desperate things. The insurance company's warning email became my ammunition for what Susan called my bureaucratic blitzkrieg, though honestly, I just thought of it as fighting fire with paperwork. I started that Wednesday morning by filing a public records request with the city asking for all traffic camera footage from our street over the past 6 months, plus any documentation about property boundaries and right-of-way designations in our neighborhood. While I called county records about property lines, Daniel reviewed perimeter angles around our house. He hadn't said a word about his plans, but I could feel him preparing for something more than defense. The clerk at City Hall seemed confused at first about why I needed such specific information, but when I mentioned an incident involving firearms on what might be city property, she suddenly got very interested and expedited my request with a bright yellow priority sticker. Meanwhile, Daniel had transformed our garage into what looked like a surveillance command center, 3 monitors showing different camera angles, all recording 24/7 with those atomic timestamps he was so particular about. Every interaction needs to be documented from multiple angles, he explained while adjusting another camera. In court, 1 video is evidence, 3 videos from different angles is truth. And he'd also started creating templates for the neighbors' official-looking letters and affidavits they could use to document their own experiences with HOA harassment. Within hours, half the neighborhood had filed counter notices using Daniel's templates, and the sudden flood of paperwork clearly caught Martha off guard based on the frantic board meeting she called for that evening. Some neighbors were scared of retaliation, though one woman broke down crying when she came to our door, said she'd seen a dark sedan following her car for the past week and was terrified of what might happen next. That same afternoon, I called the insurance company again, this time asking for a certificate of insurance specifically covering armed security activities by HOA board members. The representative put me on hold for almost 15 minutes, and when she came back, her voice had that careful tone people use when they know they're being recorded. "Sir, I need to inform you that no such certificate exists in our files, and any armed activities by board members would require separate licensing and insurance that we show no record of providing." I thanked her and immediately sent an email to Martha requesting the same certificate, copying every board member and adding a polite note about needing it for my own insurance documentation. The response came within an hour, not from Martha, but from Howard himself. A rambling message about community safety initiatives and how formal documentation wasn't necessary for neighborhood watch activities. The letters from the HOA were getting bolder and more absurd, fabricated violations that didn't even reference real covenant sections anymore, just made up rules about grass blade angles and mailbox polish requirements. I forwarded Howard's response to my lawyer friend who'd been watching this unfold with professional interest, and he replied with just 3 words: "He's completely exposed." That evening around 7 o'clock, when the sun was creating long shadows across the street, our cameras captured something that would become crucial later. Martha was walking up to different houses, but only specific ones, having hushed conversations on doorsteps with people who'd never challenged HOA decisions. The fear in some residents' faces was obvious even from our camera angle. One woman actually cried when Martha left, later telling us Martha had suggested things might get worse if she didn't support the board at Monday's meeting. The pattern became clear when Gavin mapped it out for me. The next day she was building support through fear, promising protection to those who complied and consequences to those who didn't. One of those conversations got picked up clearly by a doorbell camera, Martha saying something about outside agitators and how Daniel's presence was changing the character of our peaceful community. The coded language wasn't subtle anymore, it was a threat. Thursday brought another development when I received the city's response to my records request, delivered by a courier who needed a signature. The package included surveyor maps from 1987, clearly showing that our driveways and the adjacent 15 feet of street were designated as city right-of-way for utility access and emergency vehicles. Even better, there was a letter from the city attorney's office stating that no private entity, including homeowner associations, had enforcement authority on city property, and any attempt to police these areas could result in criminal charges for impersonating law enforcement. I made 12 copies of that letter, had them notarized, and prepared them for strategic distribution at the next meeting. The city had also included historical records showing the HOA had been warned about this boundary issue 3 times in the past decade, but had continued to ignore it. But the real gift came from Gavin that afternoon, when he pulled up his laptop screen, showing something that made everything else pale in comparison. There it was, $18,450 wired from HOA funds to an account under Martha's sister's name, dated just 2 weeks ago. "This is straight embezzlement," Gavin said, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he documented the trail. "She's been doing this for months, small amounts usually, but this one was bold, probably thought nobody would notice with all the chaos around Howard's security theater. Looking deeper, we found a pattern of payments to fake vendors, all leading back to accounts controlled by Martha or her relatives. The total was staggering, over $60,000 in just 2 years of her presidency. Daniel's reaction to the embezzlement evidence was subtle, but telling. His fist didn't clench, his voice didn't rise, but I saw something shift in his expression, like he'd crossed some internal line from defense to offense. They're using HOA funds to finance their harassment campaign, he said quietly, with controlled anger. That makes this racketeering. He started making calls to people I didn't recognize, speaking in clipped military phrases about assets and intelligence gathering. And I realized he was activating a network of veterans who'd help us document everything professionally. A woman named Jennifer Thompson from the insurance company arrived unannounced that afternoon, introducing herself as a senior investigator assigned to review potential liability issues. She spent 2 hours interviewing us, reviewing our footage, and taking photos of those city markers Gavin had identified. Before leaving, she mentioned something that made my stomach tighten with anticipation. Off the record, this is the 3rd complaint we've received about Mr. Briggs and unauthorized security activities, but the previous ones were dismissed by your board without investigation. The way she said dismissed suggested she'd found evidence of cover-ups, and I wondered how deep this corruption went. She also hinted that the state attorney general's office might be interested in a pattern of HOA fraud across multiple neighborhoods. Friday morning arrived with a registered letter from the HOA's lawyer, some downtown firm that probably charged more per hour than most people make in a week. The letter was full of legal language about covenant enforcement and community standards, but buried in the 3rd paragraph was the real threat. They were calling a special meeting for Monday night to vote on whether Daniel posed a safety risk that warranted his immediate removal from the property. I actually laughed when I read it, which confused Susan until I showed her the city attorney's letter stating the HOA had no authority where the incident occurred. They're doubling down on a losing hand. I told her, though privately I wondered what else they might try before Monday. The desperation in their legal maneuvering suggested they knew the walls were closing in. We had proof, but proof doesn't stop people like them. They escalate or they bury it. Monday night's meeting was scheduled for 7:30 at the community center, but by 7 the parking lot was already overflowing with cars I'd never seen before, including 2 black SUVs with no license plates, just chrome eagles where the numbers should have been. Martha had apparently activated every favor she could call in bringing supporters from 3 neighboring subdivisions who had no vote but would definitely have voices, and I noticed several of them had cameras pinned to their chests, like they were building their own evidence trail. I walked in with Daniel on my right and Susan on my left, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would either end this nonsense or escalate it beyond anything our quiet neighborhood had ever witnessed. The room was packed, standing room only, with Howard positioned at the front, wearing what I can only describe as his attempt at a security uniform, complete with a badge that probably came from an online surplus store. Martha called the meeting to order with her little wooden gavel, the one she'd bought herself since the HOA bylaws didn't actually provide for one, and immediately launched into what she called urgent safety concerns regarding certain residents. My heart beat slow, but my palms were damp. Not from fear, but from fury at the theatrical performance she was putting on. Before she could get rolling, I stood up and asked the question that stopped her cold. Point of order, Madam President, has proper notice been given for this meeting, according to Section 12 of our bylaws? The silence that followed was delicious, broken only by Gavin's helpful observation from the back that he'd checked the mailboxes and found no notices postmarked within the required 72-hour window. Martha's complexion shifted through several shades before she insisted that email notification was sufficient, though we all knew the bylaws specifically required physical mail for special meetings. What law, what clause, what loophole had they found to justify this emergency meeting? I wondered as Howard stood up to take control. He clicked through a PowerPoint presentation on his laptop connected to a portable projector, the first slide showing a photo of Daniel with red circles drawn around each piece of his gear. One of the men who had arrived in those unmarked SUVs was scanning our section of the room, like he was casing it, making mental notes of who was sitting where. This individual, Howard said, refusing to use Daniel's name, represents a clear threat to our community's safety and peaceful character. He clicked to the next slide showing statistics about veteran-related violence that he'd clearly pulled from some questionable website. I was about to object when Daniel stood up slowly, that measured movement that makes everyone pay attention, without him saying a word. "My name is Daniel Harris," he said, voice carrying across the room with authority. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. I have 2 Bronze Stars, a combat infantryman badge, and an honorable discharge after 8 years of service." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table in front of Martha. "These are my service records, unredacted, available for anyone who questions my background." Then he turned to Howard, and the temperature in the room dropped. "Mr. Briggs, you've accused me of stolen valor. That's a serious allegation. Would you like to call Fort Bragg right now to verify my service?" Howard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no sound coming out. I didn't move from my seat, and this time neither did Daniel, both of us maintaining perfect stillness that seemed to unnerve Howard more than any aggressive response would have. Someone from the back shouted about Daniel being armed and dangerous, and I recognized the voice as one of Howard's drinking buddies from the bar 3 blocks over. Daniel reached into his pocket slowly, making sure everyone could see his movements, and pulled out his phone to show his concealed carry permit on the screen. "Every piece of equipment I carry is legal, registered, and within my rights as a citizen," he said calmly. "Unlike Mr. Briggs, who carries a firearm while performing security duties without a state license, which is actually a felony." The room erupted into chaos, but that's when the insurance investigator stood up from where she'd been sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes. "Jennifer Thompson, senior investigator with Midwest Mutual Insurance." She announced her professional bearing, making everyone shut up immediately. "Mr. Briggs, are you aware that performing armed security services without proper licensing voids all insurance coverage and exposes you to personal liability exceeding $500,000. Howard went pale as she continued. "I should also mention that we've received footage of board members conspiring to harass certain residents." Martha tried to interrupt, saying this was a private meeting, but a woman named Karen, who had been sitting silently near the door, suddenly spoke up. She hadn't said a word until now, but her eyes had been scanning everything, like she was collecting intel, and now she stood with her phone raised. "I've been recording this entire meeting," Karen announced, "and I'm Martha's former assistant. I quit last month when I discovered she was embezzling HOA funds." The room went dead silent as Karen connected her phone to the projector, replacing Howard's presentation, with bank statements showing the $18,000 transfer we'd found, plus dozens of smaller transactions going back 2 years. Martha's complexion drained completely as her own financial crimes were displayed for everyone to see. But Howard wasn't done self-destructing, yet jumping up and pointing at Daniel while shouting about how veterans think they own everything, how his son had been rejected by the same unit Daniel served in. The revelation about his personal vendetta hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Daniel's response was remarkable in its restraint, simply saying he was sorry. Tyler didn't qualify that the evaluation process exists to protect both soldiers and their units. That lit Howard's fuse completely, and he started moving toward Daniel, reaching for what I assumed was his weapon. Gavin's voice rang out. "I've been streaming this to 700 viewers. Everyone just saw you reach for a weapon." Howard froze mid-step as sirens approached. Someone in those 700 viewers had called the police about a potentially violent situation. I pulled out my final document, the cease and desist letter from the city attorney's office, and handed copies to Martha and each board member present. "This letter formally notifies you that the original incident occurred entirely on city property where you have zero authority. They walked away like victors, but victory sometimes blinds you to the counterattack being prepared. Every morning, a new envelope, new ink, same threat. The police arrival at Monday's meeting should have been the end, but wounded pride makes people do stupid things, as I learned over coffee Tuesday morning. I didn't mark days anymore. I counted violations, grass height, mailbox angle, firewood, alignment. Susan held up the latest notice about our garden hose coiling incorrectly and actually laughed. "They're measuring the spiral radius of water hoses now," she said, and I could only shake my head at the absurdity. Gavin had spent the night digging through public records, piecing together what he called the saddest origin story never told. Howard's son Tyler tried enlisting last year, he explained, showing me screenshots from Tyler's old posts full of military quotes and special forces logos. Kid documented everything: training videos, diet plans, even bought the same gear Daniel carries, but when he got to the psychological evaluation, they flagged him for the same impulse control issues as his father. The rejection letter Tyler had posted before deleting it came from the recruitment office attached to Daniel's former unit. I'd spent my life avoiding battles. Now it felt like I'd been drafted into one I didn't start but couldn't afford to lose. "So, this isn't just about power," I said, understanding Howard's rage. "Daniel represents everything his son couldn't become." Gavin nodded, then showed me something that made my coffee taste bitter. Howard had been researching Daniel for weeks before the confrontation, pulling public records veteran databases, even trying to access deployment records through a VA contact. "He was building a case before there was even a crime," he said. Jennifer called while we were talking, her voice urgent. "Mr. Harris, our investigation has uncovered systematic insurance fraud. The HOA has been collecting security fees from residents and claiming coverage for armed patrols that we never authorized." She explained that Martha had been submitting false documentation to justify rate increases, pocketing the difference. "We're talking about $60,000 over 2 years, she said. This wasn't just about Howard's power trip anymore. This was criminal fraud that could mean federal prison. She asked for documentation about security fees, and I remembered those weird line items Martha always brushed off as administrative costs. I promised to send everything, then noticed Daniel in the doorway, having heard the conversation. He moved silently through the shadows of our house now, his boots making no sound on gravel when he checked the perimeter each night. "They're going to get desperate now," he said with measured certainty. "When people realize they're facing prison, instead of just losing their little kingdom, they stop thinking rationally." He was right, which became obvious when a black SUV appeared an hour later. Engine idling, no movement, no plate, just sitting across from our driveway. Howard wasn't in it, but someone was watching, waiting. Susan wanted to call the police immediately, but Daniel suggested we wait, let them make the first move while cameras recorded. "Every minute they sit there is another minute of stalking charges," he explained, though I could see his hand near his phone. I'd seen him deploy overseas, but never like this silent domestic personal. The standoff lasted 43 minutes before Tyler Briggs pulled up and got out, walking straight to the SUV. We couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. Tyler was angry, gesturing at our house, then at the vehicle, obviously trying to get whoever was inside to leave. The argument escalated until Tyler reached into the vehicle and pulled something out. Then the SUV suddenly drove off. Howard had to call Martha for a ride later, and the humiliation on his face as he waited told me Tyler had taken more than just keys. Wednesday brought news that the state attorney general's office was now involved. "Insurance fraud crossing state lines makes this their jurisdiction," Jennifer explained. 2 investigators showed up that afternoon in dark suits. They spent 3 hours going through our documentation, watching footage, asking detailed questions. Special Agent Morrison seemed particularly interested in the conspiracy video. "This shows clear coordination to deprive you of civil rights through color of law," she said. That evening, reviewing security footage, I noticed something odd in Sunday night's video. A car parked down the street with someone using binoculars pointed at our house. Going back through previous nights, the same car appeared multiple times. Daniel immediately recognized the surveillance pattern. They hired someone to watch us, he said grimly. Probably didn't tell them we have cameras that can see them watching us. We documented every instance, creating a timeline showing professional surveillance going back almost a week. Thursday morning changed everything when the elderly woman from down the street knocked on our door in tears. "They're trying to take my house," she sobbed, showing a notice claiming she owed $8,000 in fines going back 2 years. All suddenly due within 30 days, or they'd begin foreclosure. Looking at the dates, these were retroactive fines to punish her for sharing her doorbell footage with us. "This is witness intimidation," Daniel stated, already calling Jennifer. Within an hour, 3 more neighbors came forward with similar notices. The pattern was clear. Howard and Martha were scorching the earth, trying to drive out opposition or bankrupt them into silence, but they'd miscalculated badly. Jennifer immediately contacted the state investigators, who issued an emergency injunction, freezing all HOA enforcement actions. When Martha received that injunction Thursday afternoon, delivered by a sheriff's deputy, she made the mistake of calling me directly. "You've destroyed this community," she hissed. "Whatever happens next is on you." I recorded the call, adding it to our evidence. "Martha," I replied calmly, "you destroyed this community the moment you let Howard carry a gun without a license." Friday arrived with ominous quiet. No HOA vehicles patrolling, no notices being posted, even Howard's truck absent from surveillance spots. Daniel didn't trust the silence, installing motion sensors that would alert his phone if anyone approached. In Afghanistan, quiet days meant someone was planning something big, he explained. Sure enough, around 10 that night, his phone started pinging. We checked cameras to see Howard and 5 men wearing matching community protection shirts gathering in the parking lot behind the community center. They had walkie-talkies, clipboards, and what looked like tactical gear. "They're organizing something for tomorrow," Daniel observed, watching them spread out what appeared to be a map. Howard pointed at different areas, assigning positions like planning a military operation. One man raised what was clearly a rifle case from his truck, but Daniel stopped me from calling it in, pointing at another vehicle pulling into the lot. It was Tyler Briggs with 2 police officers, apparently off duty, but carrying badges. Tyler pointed at his father's group, explaining something to the officers, who made a radio call. "The son is turning in his own father," Susan whispered from behind us. We thought they were watching us, but that night we learned they had already made their move elsewhere. Saturday morning arrived at exactly 6 with what I can only describe as a suburban siege, though the word doesn't capture the calculated menace of it. No knock, no call, just footsteps, deliberate, heavy. Multiple vehicles converged on our street, positioning themselves to block every exit from our driveway while technically remaining on public property. Howard was in the lead vehicle with his community protection squad, each member wearing those black shirts like uniforms, holding clipboards and air horns like weapons of mass annoyance. My hand hovered over the phone while Daniel's hand was already on the door latch, ready but controlled. They'd learned to avoid our property line, instead clustering on that strip of city right-of-way they'd previously claimed to control. The air horn started at 6:15, sharp blasts every 30 seconds, synchronized like they'd practiced this. When that didn't get a response from us, they switched to shouting violations through megaphones. Mailbox is 2 inches too tall. Driveway has oil stains exceeding acceptable limits. Visible security cameras create an unwelcoming environment. Daniel watched from the window, counting the participants and noting their positions in a notebook. He didn't draw any weapon, didn't need to. His stance alone shifted the odds in the room. "They want me to come out angry," he said. "Give them an excuse to claim self-defense when something happens." But Susan had a different idea, one that turned their whole plan sideways. She walked out carrying a tray of coffee and donuts, approaching the group with her teacher smile that could disarm angry parents at school conferences. "Good morning, gentlemen. You must be cold out here so early. Would anyone like some coffee?" The confusion on their faces was priceless. especially when she started asking about their families, their jobs, making normal conversation like they weren't standing there with air horns and bogus violation notices. One younger guy actually reached for a donut before Howard slapped his hand away, but the damage was done. Susan had humanized the situation, made it harder for them to maintain their aggressive stance. Such dedication to the community, she continued sweetly. I'm sure your employers would be proud to know you're spending your Saturday morning doing this volunteer work. That comment hit its mark, as several men shifted uncomfortably, probably realizing their faces were being recorded and could end up attached to their real names and jobs. Susan's final touch was pulling out her phone for a selfie with the group in the background, saying she wanted to document community involvement for her teaching blog. 3 of Howard's volunteers immediately walked back to their cars and left, but Howard doubled down, pulling out a folder and announcing loudly that they had evidence of Daniel running an illegal military training operation from our property. This was news to me, since Daniel's idea of backyard activity was reading deployment memoirs in a lawn chair. Howard produced printed screenshots of Daniel carrying boxes from his truck, circled and annotated like evidence of weapons trafficking. These boxes could contain anything, Howard declared. Military equipment, weapons, surveillance devices. Daniel finally walked outside carrying his own folder. Mr. Briggs, he said calmly, those boxes contained books. I have the receipts here from Barnes & Noble. He spread the receipts on Howard's truck hood, showing clearly that the suspicious boxes contained military history books and leadership manuals. The room didn't shift when he spoke. It shifted when he looked at them, that steady gaze that had faced down actual threats in actual war zones. But more interesting, Daniel continued, is that you knew exactly when I was unloading those boxes, which means you've been surveilling my activities. He pulled out his phone, showing a compilation video our cameras had captured Howard's hired investigator, the mysterious car with binoculars, even Howard himself using a telephoto lens from his bedroom window. Every instance of surveillance is documented here with timestamps. The remaining volunteers started backing away from Howard, realizing they had attached themselves to something that looked like stalking. By 9 o'clock, Howard's Saturday offensive had dwindled to just him and 2 loyalists still standing on the city, right of way, but looking increasingly pathetic. That's when an elderly neighbor from 3 houses down came out with his camera and started interviewing Howard about his security qualifications. For my neighborhood newsletter, he explained, then proceeded to ask increasingly uncomfortable questions about Howard's training certification and legal authority. Howard tried to deflect, but the man had done his homework, citing specific state statutes and insurance requirements. The breaking point came around noon, when a news van pulled up, apparently tipped off by someone watching the live stream. The reporter approached Howard with her microphone, asking about reports of unauthorized militia activity in this residential neighborhood. Howard's expressions cycled through several emotions before he managed to sputter something about liberal media bias and walked away. But not before the camera caught him shoving the reporter's microphone. His 2 remaining supporters disappeared quickly after that, leaving Howard standing alone on the sidewalk. Daniel chose that moment for what he called a tactical kindness strike, walking out with a bottle of water for Howard. You look dehydrated, Mr. Briggs. Heat stroke is serious at your age. The comment about age was a subtle dig, but the gesture was genuinely concerned, which just made Howard angrier. He knocked the bottle away and started screaming about respect and authority. The news camera caught all of it, this man in his fake security shirt losing his mind at a veteran offering him water. Jennifer called an hour later to inform us that the insurance company had officially terminated all coverage for the HOA effective immediately. The board members are now personally liable for any legal consequences, she explained, and mentioned that several residents had already indicated plans to file civil suits. But there was something else in her voice, a new tension. Karen from the board filed a warrant this morning, she said. Howard's going to deliver it personally. They're claiming emergency powers under a clause nobody's ever used. As the sun began setting, Daniel and I stood in the driveway, looking at the tire marks Howard had left behind. Tomorrow's going to be worse, Daniel predicted. When someone like Howard realizes he's lost everything, that's when they're most dangerous. Around 9 that night, a message appeared in a private group chat. Project Clean Driveways starts at dawn. Target acquired, with Daniel's photo circled in red. Daniel saw it too, his expression shifting to what Susan calls his deployment face. "They're going to come at night," he said with absolute certainty. "The dawn message is misdirection." Howard left shaking. Karen didn't, and that scared me more. Sunday night came faster than expected, and Daniel's prediction about misdirection proved terrifyingly accurate. At 9 p.m. sharp, not dawn like the leaked message suggested, Howard led his group through the back gate, using what he apparently thought was a clever approach via the city right-of-way path behind our properties. "You're putting us at risk," a neighbor had confronted me earlier that day. "They're turning on all of us because of you." The community tension was palpable, people choosing sides not based on right or wrong, but on fear of retaliation. Our cameras caught everything in crystal clarity, those city markers Gavin had identified weeks ago, visible in every frame like breadcrumbs leading to their own legal destruction. Howard was wearing what looked like a tactical vest he'd bought online, leading 6 men who seemed less confident than they had that morning, probably because darkness and actual confrontation hit different than harassing someone in broad daylight. "Community detainment for threatening board members," Howard announced to our backyard, apparently believing that saying words with authority made them legally binding. I stepped onto our back porch with my phone already recording, making sure my voice carried clear and steady. "Mr. Briggs, you're currently trespassing on private property after entering through city-owned land where you have no enforcement authority. The police have been notified." That last part wasn't entirely true yet, but Daniel had his finger hovering over the call button waiting for my signal. He mapped out timelines on the kitchen wall, earlier patterns, people pressure points, preparing for exactly this moment. Howard's response was to reach for what I assumed was his weapon, that same motion he'd made Tuesday, but with less hesitation, now desperation overriding whatever caution remained. "Community rules supersede individual property rights during security emergencies," he declared, which sounded like something he'd made up in his truck on the way over. Daniel moved with the fluid precision I'd only seen in military training videos, positioning himself between Howard and the house, while maintaining perfect defensive distance. "Sir, you're about to commit aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Multiple cameras are recording. Please reconsider your actions." His voice had that same flat calm from Afghanistan, the tone that meant he was running scenarios and calculating response times. Howard's hand moved another inch toward his holster, and that's when Daniel did something I didn't expect. Instead of escalating, he simply sat down on the porch steps, hands visible, and relaxed completely, removing any perception of threat. "Mr. Briggs, I'm sitting down. I'm unarmed. There's no danger here except what you're creating." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating to Howard's narrative. His group started shifting nervously, probably realizing how this would look in court, 6 men confronting someone who literally sat down to de-escalate. One of them, a younger guy I recognized from the hardware store, actually said, "Howard, maybe we should go. This isn't what you told us we were doing." But Howard was too far gone, pulling his weapon and pointing it at Daniel while screaming about protecting the community from dangerous elements. That's when Gavin's evidence finally came into play, delivered in a 2-beat sequence that changed everything. My phone buzzed with an email, then immediately a screenshot of bank transactions. She wasn't just corrupt, I realized looking at the screen. Martha was laundering HOA funds through dead addresses. I held up my phone to show Howard the document Jennifer Thompson had sent. "Mr. Briggs, this is proof that Martha has been stealing from every resident here. You're protecting a criminal enterprise. The FBI knows. They're coming." The words seemed to finally penetrate Howard's adrenaline fog, and I saw his eyes flick to those markers visible in our motion sensor lights. His hand started shaking, the weapon wavering between Daniel and me. "We were wrong," a voice called from the darkness, one of Howard's former supporters stepping into the light. "We were scared. Now we're angry. Put the gun down, Howard." More neighbors emerged from the shadows, people who had been watching waiting, finally choosing a side. The community flip was happening in real time, and Howard could feel it. But then we all heard them, sirens, multiple vehicles getting closer fast. Not just regular patrol cars either, but the distinct sound of the tactical unit that Daniel had apparently requested when he'd called this in 10 minutes ago. Federal marshals are also en route, Daniel said quietly. The insurance fraud investigation elevated this to federal jurisdiction. When they refused discovery, we subpoenaed the county directly. Everything's documented. Howard's group scattered like roaches when you turn on a kitchen light, running back through the gate toward their vehicles. The first police car screeched to a stop in front of our house, officers approaching with their own weapons drawn, shouting for Howard to drop his gun. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but felt like 10 minutes, Howard's face cycling through denial, rage, and finally, a crushing realization that his whole world had just ended. He set the weapon on the ground with exaggerated slowness, then raised his hands as officers moved in for the arrest. Howard Briggs, you're under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, criminal, threatening trespassing, impersonating law enforcement, conspiracy to violate civil rights. The officer reading the charges had to pull out a second card to finish the list. As they cuffed him, Howard looked at Daniel with pure hatred and said something that would become important later. Your kind always think you're heroes. My son is twice the man you'll ever be. Daniel's response was measured and devastating. Your son called the police on you Friday night, Mr. Briggs. He's the one who reported your plans. The look on Howard's face when that information hit was something I'll never forget, like watching a building implode in slow motion. Martha arrived just as they were putting Howard in the patrol car, her face pale in the flashing lights. She tried to approach the officers saying something about a misunderstanding and HOA business, but Special Agent Rebecca Morrison was already there with federal agents. Martha Lane, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, insurance, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights under color of law. The federal agents were significantly less gentle than the local police, cuffing Martha and walking her to their black SUV while she demanded to call her lawyer. Morrison turned to me before leaving and said something that felt like the real ending to this story. The city attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow about recovering damages for the HOA residents. As the various law enforcement vehicles pulled away, leaving our quiet street in sudden silence, neighbors started emerging from their houses like survivors after a bombing. The elderly woman from down the street was crying with relief, hugging Susan and repeating, "It's over," like a prayer. Gavin was already on his laptop documenting everything for what he called the definitive record of HOA corruption. Daniel stood next to me finally, allowing his military bearing to relax, and for the first time since Tuesday, I saw him smile genuinely. Nice work with the city property documentation, Dad. Perfect tactical timing. I wanted to feel victorious, but mostly I just felt tired and sad about how far suburban politics had pushed a man already broken by his son's rejection. Looking around at my neighbors' faces, some celebrating and others looking shell-shocked, I realized this wasn't really about winning or losing. This was about a community that had allowed power to concentrate in the wrong hands and nearly paid a terrible price for it. They thought they had the system, but they'd forgotten we had records and soldiers. Monday morning's meeting with the city attorney felt like walking into a different universe from the chaos of the previous week. Her office was all polished wood and legal books, the kind of place where violence was something that happened in case files, not your backyard. A drone had hovered near our mailbox that morning, then disappeared, one last attempt at intimidation that seemed pathetic now. She introduced herself as Patricia Williams and spent the first 10 minutes reviewing the stack of evidence we'd compiled, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification about specific incidents. This is the most thoroughly documented case of HOA overreach I've seen in 20 years, she finally said, setting down her pen. The numbers she presented were staggering: $60,000 in stolen insurance fees, $40,000 in illegal fines, another $30,000 in kickbacks from contractors that Martha had been steering to her brother's company. Gavin slowly revealed frame-by-frame footage of Martha's private meetings with these contractors, each transaction documented. "That's our garage," Susan said with shock, pointing at one image. "That's from before we even moved in. They've been planning this for years." Williams explained that every resident who paid these fraudulent fees was entitled to full restitution plus damages. The city is also revoking the HOA's authority over any public right-of-way and installing permanent signage to prevent future confusion. She showed us mock-ups of the signs, big official-looking things that said city property, no private enforcement authority, in letters nobody could pretend to misunderstand. The legal machinery moved faster than I expected, probably because the state attorney general's office wanted to make an example of suburban corruption. By Wednesday, Howard had been formally charged with 7 different felonies, while Martha faced federal racketeering charges that could result in 20 years imprisonment. The other board members who'd participated in the fraud scheme were offered plea deals in exchange for testimony, and most of them took it, probably realizing that loyalty to Martha wasn't worth destroying their own lives. Tyler Briggs actually came by our house that afternoon looking exhausted but determined to apologize properly. "My dad lost himself after I got rejected from the military," Tyler explained, standing awkwardly on our porch while Daniel and I listened. "He couldn't accept that his son didn't have what it takes, so he built this whole fantasy about protecting the neighborhood, being the warrior I couldn't be. When he found out you were everything he wanted me to become," Tyler trailed off, but we understood. Howard had projected his disappointment onto Daniel, turning him into a symbol of his own failures as a father. "I'm testifying against him," Tyler continued, "not because I hate him, but because he needs to face reality before he hurts someone worse than he already has." Daniel stopped reviewing footage after that visit. He started preparing contingencies instead. He wrote statements, recorded depositions, quiet surgical work that would ensure nothing got buried or forgotten. "He's not just fighting back," Susan observed. "He's controlling the narrative now." Was I endangering us all by staying, I wondered, or was leaving exactly what they wanted? The answer came clearer with each neighbor who thanked us for standing up to the corruption. The emergency HOA meeting that Thursday was standing room only again, but the energy was completely different from Monday's confrontation. The state had appointed a temporary administrator to oversee the transition, a no-nonsense woman named Carol Davidson, who had handled similar situations across the state. She walked us through the process of dissolving the current board, recovering stolen funds, and establishing new bylaws with actual oversight and term limits. "Your previous board operated like a small dictatorship," she said bluntly. "We're going to ensure that never happens again with mandatory transparency requirements and regular audits." The vote to dissolve the current board was unanimous, even from people who'd supported Howard initially. Seeing him on the news in handcuffs had shattered whatever authority they'd imagined he possessed. The vote for new board members was more interesting, with the elderly woman from down the street nominated and elected president by overwhelming majority. "I'm 73 years old," she said in her acceptance speech. "Too old for power trips and too tired for drama. We're going to run this HOA like adults, with boring meetings and transparent budgets and absolutely no one carrying guns." Howard's plea hearing 2 weeks later was almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened. He stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller, somehow deflated like a balloon, with all the air let out. His lawyer had negotiated a deal: 3 years in prison, 5 years, probation, lifetime ban on possessing firearms, and mandatory anger management therapy. But the judge added something that felt like poetic justice: 1,000 hours of community service, specifically teaching conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques. Howard accepting that deal, his voice barely audible as he pled guilty to all charges, was the closest thing to accountability I'd seen from him. Martha's trial would take longer, the federal case requiring more preparation, but Jennifer Thompson told us she'd already agreed to pay full restitution to avoid additional civil suits. The insurance company is pursuing separate charges, Jennifer explained during her final visit to our neighborhood. She'll likely lose everything House Savings' reputation. The other insurance companies have blacklisted her entirely. There was no satisfaction in hearing about Martha's downfall, just a sense of waste at how greed and power had corrupted what should have been simple community management. Daniel returned to active duty 3 weeks after the arrest, his leave ending with perfect timing. Before he left, he installed one final camera pointed directly at the new city property sign in front of our house. "Just in case someone forgets," he said with that dry humor that had carried him through war zones and suburban battles alike. Watching him pack his gear careful and methodical, like always, I realized how much his training had saved us. Not the combat skills or tactical knowledge, but the discipline to document everything, to de-escalate rather than escalate, to use patience and process as weapons more powerful than any gun. The neighborhood felt different after everything settled, quieter, but also more connected. People actually talk to each other now, instead of just filing complaints. The new HOA board met monthly in boring, productive sessions that nobody attended because there was no drama to witness. Property values actually went up once word spread that we'd cleaned house so thoroughly. Gavin turned his documentation into a series of articles about HOA reform that got picked up by national outlets, using our story as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority in small organizations. 6 months later, I got a letter from Howard in prison. It was short, not quite an apology, but something approaching recognition of what he'd done. He wrote about attending therapy, learning about projection and displaced anger, coming to terms with his son's limitations and his own. "I turned your son into an enemy because I couldn't face my own failures," he wrote. "I'm sorry for what I put your family through." I didn't write back, but I kept the letter as a reminder that even the worst confrontations sometimes lead to necessary reckonings. Looking back now, that Tuesday afternoon when Howard pointed a gun at my son feels like it belonged to another life entirely. The new families in our neighborhood walk their dogs and wave at each other, never knowing there was once a time when HOA patrols stalked the sidewalks like wannabe enforcers. The signs now marking public property lines still stand, not just as boundaries but as reminders. Daniel once told me that paperwork hits harder than fists, and he was right. In the end, it wasn't strength that won, it was persistence, records, and the simple truth that carrying groceries shouldn't be a life or death event. Maybe the real lesson here is you don't need a weapon to fight back, just a spine and a printer. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this one struck a chord, the little thanks button below really helps me keep sharing stories like this. Be safe out there, and don't let petty power scare you quiet.